I'd like to welcome you to today's session. My name is Brandon Gill, and our first presenter is Dr. Mario Norbis. Professor Norbis currently teaches at Quinnipiac University. He has his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry Engineering at the University of Uruguay, Montevideo, Uruguay. He was taught at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, University of Massachusetts. He was invited professor at HEC Paris and ESC Rennes, France. His industrial experience includes the oil industry and manufacturing. Professor Norbis has published in areas as diverse as operations and supply chain, knowledge management, international business education, and university policies. And the title of his presentation is Risk and the Network Effect, a Multidisciplinary Approach. Welcome.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here in our last day of conference this year. Today, would like to share with you a little bit about risk and the network effect. And we're going to start from the very basic ideas. We're going to start looking into a very specific case of the supply chain for which most of this approach was developed. But then we're going to move and try to share with you and get feedback from you about how do you think that this transfers into other different areas of our everyday activities or everyday lives. I'm trying to see if I can change it from here. Can I? There you go. Basic idea of a chain. When we talk of a chain, a supplier, a carrier, and a buyer. Okay. Imagine for a moment this is a supply chain, but that is also part of, could be somebody providing information, somebody moving that information, somebody receiving that information. Okay. So that is just a basic representation, visual representation of what we will be talking about. The risk management process is somehow defined by 3 or 4 different activities that start with risk identification, then assessment, which is perhaps the most difficult and the most involved part of it in the sense that it requires certain type of metrics, okay, and then risk response. And finally, for many authors, the risk management process finishes somewhere here, but actually some others extended to response control, meaning what happened and how we control the process after the response. So we keep moving. There are 2 dimensions of risk. We identify, also identify 2 different dimensions of risk. The first is the likelihood or the probability that the event may occur. And the second is what is the impact that it will have. Basically, when you combine these 2, is what you come with something that in management science, for example, is called as expected monetary value or expected monetary loss. Okay? When you combine the probability with the loss. Now, in order to measure this, direct evaluation of the likelihood of an event implies subjectivity. Okay? And so the different methods of doing it are very, they are questions and they are very controversial. Other people, like Close and McGarrell in 2004, and myself and Professor Meixel in 2012, suggest a different way, which is to evaluate security scores, meaning in different areas, the behavior, okay, or the different type of activities or behavior of each of the elements is ranked in a scale. Then we say we assign a security score. the risk will become the inverse, or actually 1 minus the security score. Okay? And then we go with that and to measure the impact or the consequences that that event occurring will have for the organization. As we move on, considering about risk, we are going to be talking about 2 different types of risks. There may be many different types of risks. We and other authors identify 2 different types of risk. Operational risk, defined by Chopra and Sodhi in 2004, is used by us in our publication. We call it risk type 1. Okay? Operational risk is all those risks that are associated with normal events. Talking again in the supply chain, we will be talking about late deliveries, damaged parts, wrong identification of parts. Okay, all of them have relatively high probability and relatively low cost, meaning low effect for the organization. Meanwhile, Tang, and we assume also that Tang definition of 2006 of disruptional risk, or type, what we call type 2 risk, are risks that come from nature or man-made catastrophes that somehow impact in a tremendous way and disrupt all the delivery and the movement in the supply chain or in our lives. Normally, the probability of this risk are much, much lower, and the effects are much, much bigger. Okay? So, in one way, one compensates one with the other, but still the final result is more or less the same. Now, the situation is, and again, this advocate for the idea of not trying to evaluate the probability of a risk occurring, but rather the security scores. This particular risk, the probability of this particular risk, are so low that any type of subjectivity error in estimation become very big in relative terms, okay? Because the risk is absolutely very, very small. Okay? But the consequences normally are very big. So basically what we identify these 2 different types of risks that we call risk type 1 and risk type 2, and we're going to be talking about them. As I said before, we are talking and presenting this somehow in the frame of the supply chain, but allow me to do that in order to move later on to other frames. Okay, as we move on, 3 constituents of risk. The individual risk. Okay, for example, one particular supplier or one individual carrier represent risk because of their practices. Because of their practice, they represent, and that is particular that individual element of the supply chain, that could be ourselves, okay, that represent some type of risk, and we are going to call that the individual risk. Then there is the risk involved in a direct interaction, meaning if supplier A will deliver through carrier B, that combination, supplier-carrier, implies some type of risk because of the association of the carrier and supplier. We are going to see in a moment that not necessarily means that the risk increase, but sometimes the risk could be attenuated. And we are going to analyze that. That is direct interaction 1-to-1. Okay? Now, the whole network that represents my supply chain, okay, the whole way that the supply chain is designed, let's say multiple suppliers versus one supplier, multiple routes, multiple carriers, okay? Those elements, we call it, that are part of the supply chain design, was called the network effect. Okay? So we are going to be analyzing how to represent and how to look into these different type of risk. We move on. Typical supply chain case, as it was represented in the first slides anyway. We have a supplier that will provide some type of product, merchandise, or service through, to a buyer through a carrier, okay? And this is a very schematic way of the representation. Hi, how are you? Okay? Individual type of risk, okay? The supplier have risk type 1 and risk type 2. Okay. For the carrier, we identify also risk type 1 and risk type 2 for each carrier, for each supplier, and for each port that are involved in the process, we identify also risk type 1 and risk type 2. And these are the individual risks associated with each, we can say, element of the supply chain. Okay? Now, when it's produced an interaction, okay, risk type 1 is incurred when there is a direct interaction between members I and K, okay, of the supply chain. And risk type 2, that it comes as a, is incurred when it happens an interaction between the same two members of the supply chain. Now, these risks are calculated as some function of the individual risk. Okay, those risks are calculated as some function of the individual risk based on some rules, and we're going to analyze them a little bit now. By the way, graphically, we represent this interaction risk through another node in the graphical representation, meaning the individual are represented by nodes, and their interaction is also represented by nodes in the graphical representation. As we move, this interaction between two members could be neutral, could be positive, or could be negative interaction. We define this in terms of how the interaction affect the risk, or the individual risk. For example, in a neutral interaction, the interaction between these two elements of the supply chain, and let's assume that is a supplier and a carrier, does not affect the combined combined risk. Okay? The individual risks are independent of this interaction, and so they are not affected. And in that case, we will say that the interaction is neutral, and the combined risk will be the highest of the two, meaning the highest risk of the two is, we can say, the weakest link in the chain. Okay? But what is a positive interaction? A positive interaction will happen when, for example, one of the two members has very well-known and established procedures that, in a way, override any risk that could be incurred by the other member. And in that case, the combined risk will be lower than that it will be the individual risk. Let me give you an example. For example, if I have a supplier that provides me with some product from somewhere, little known, with which I don't know too much about their procedures, or perhaps doesn't have two very well written and established security procedures. Okay. But I will buy through them, and they will transport through UPS, who have very well-established procedures for checking the cargo and the movement of the cargo, etc. That combination enhances the security, meaning reduce the risk that will eventually be represented by the supplier individually, and the whole combination is less risky for us. Okay. That is the idea of a positive interaction. The idea of a negative interaction could be also exemplified by some harbor procedures or situations in which or situations in which a carrier could have a given, national flag that may represent a special type of risk by touching a given port along the way, for example. And that beyond the risk that that carrier or that port will represent for us, the fact that this carrier with this flag will touch that particular port from that particular country enhance the risk, increasing the risk somehow. Okay, so this is how the direct interaction between carriers and suppliers, between two elements of the supply chain will affect the individual risk. But there is one more element that I would like to consider and would like to share with you, and what is called the asymmetric relationship. Let me give an example and try to see how this can be affect risk. Asymmetric relationship is an area that is very well explored by marketing. People in the area of marketing explore symmetric or asymmetric relationship. For example, let's say in the 90s, the automaker industry start reducing their base of suppliers. Okay? Before, they have a large number of suppliers for every single part, and everybody compete, and it was very good for them. Everybody compete with each other, and they get the best price, the best delivery, etc. Now, in the 90s, they come to a sole supplier, and eventually a second supplier. This sole supplier has the benefit of having the complete demand of that particular automaker for them. But on the other hand, the automaker will put their own conditions. I'm using the example of the automaker industry, not just as a random example, because it was where actually it started happening. Okay? So it's a real example where this happened. Okay? And so under that conditions, the automaker, for example, could demand that this supplier will keep inventory for them. Okay, and will show their cost equations. Okay, so in a way to justify their cost, and the supplier will do that because it's a tremendous convenience for them to sell to Ford Motor Company, for example. But on the other hand, now Ford Motor Company knows their cost equation and can squeeze them. And in fact, as a matter of fact, they did. Okay. The same situation happened with Walmart, for example, and there is a very good study by a colleague of us in Quinnipiac University, Professor Grossman, who actually published a study about, from the marketing point of view, about the situation of the sole supplier for Walmart. Okay? Everybody wanted to be the sole supplier for Walmart, but on the other hand, the conditions to which they are subject are. Okay, given that kind of example, or to say a little bit what asymmetric relationship is, now we go to the question, how this asymmetric relationship, that is also a one-to-one relationship, affect risk? And that's an open question. I don't have too much into that. So I could be inclined to think that certainly the type of security and the risk involved by the dominant part in the relationship will be the one who impose. Okay? But it's another effect, another parameter to take into consideration in the direct interaction risk. As we move on, okay, a case of direct interaction, how we represent this graphically? Well, we represent it simply as a network in which a supplier can go through this particular carrier and with that interaction risk, or to this other carrier with this interaction risk. And in a way, we will be looking for the safer path. or the less risky path between S and B. Okay, so that is the idea of moving this into a graphical representation. Now we are going to analyze other two cases before to go into some questions and ideas. In this case, we have one supplier and two carriers, okay, two possible carriers. One carrier that comes directly from the supplier to me, but here we have a second carrier that eventually it touches another port. Okay? It's not that in that port, it's not that in this port my load will be either I will be buying more or delivering there. No. My load comes from supplier 1, okay, and coming to carrier, but carrier will touch supplier 2, okay, to pick up something else, etc. Now, what other risk is added just because of that? That is routing, and that has to do with the design of the supply chain. Okay? That is structural, that is risk that is associated not with a one-to-one relationship, but rather with the overall design of the structure of the supply chain. Another very typical case of a structure that will will affect risk is the situation of double supplier. Okay? And double supplier may be seen in many different ways. Actually, double supplier is, let's say, opposite to single supplier, sole source. Okay? Here we have double source, or we may have a alternated double source, meaning in this case, in this previous case, we have two different sources that are acting simultaneously, meaning each one takes percentage of my demand. Meanwhile, here this is a sole source. Meanwhile, here we have two different sources, but they are not necessarily acting simultaneously. And so, we make some ideas and conclusions about these different structures and different situations with the supply chain. Now, let's move this away from the suppliers, away from the car. Okay, let's think the supplier are not more producers. Let's move away from trucks or plane or train as carriers. Okay, and we are all people, and we are all elements of some supply chain. We all are connected to some supply chain, okay, somehow. Okay. Here, for example, we are all connected to Nasib, somehow. Yeah, there you are. Okay. Have you seen it? No, you haven't. Okay. So, in any case, we are all connected in one way or the other. Okay. Now, how much that affects risk? Okay. How much that affects risk? Okay. I have more questions than answers. Okay. And just can you put this on the table? First of all,
you're talking about risk or about entropy?
I'm talking about
the source of entropy.
Yes, that's true. That's true. So now the question is, first of all, in the human, let's call it that way, supply chain, where we move more than anything information. More than anything information. Okay? What is a risk type 1 and what is a risk type 2? What is a catastrophic risk and what is a regular risk? Okay? Like in the supply chain, operational risk will be a late delivery. Meanwhile, a catastrophic risk will be a tsunami, okay, or a plane crash. Okay? Now, in the human part of our supply chain, where we're related with banks through our computers, or we pass all our information of our proposals to the conference. Okay? What are the type of risk? Okay? I'm very sure that for each of us, these risks are different. The way that we define, okay, catastrophic risks, okay, for somebody may include just health. For some other people will be health and jobs. There will be a different way that we. Now, but the way we associate it with each other, okay, and the way we share that, because association is that share, okay, it will somehow affect that combination of risk in this supply chain that we share. I just wanted to leave that kind of as a thought. Okay. What did we find? Some ideas for future research. Duplication does not necessarily minimize risks. Many people think if I have two sources, or if I have two banks, or if I have two jobs, okay, the risk will be minimized. Sometimes, not necessarily. In the supply chain, and now I'm not talking about in particular the supply chain of people, but in the supply chain, the more elements, the more supplier, the more career I put in the increase the risk, perhaps diminish the risk of late deliveries, but it will increase the risk of catastrophic events. The more people have their hands, or the possibility of having their hands on my product, the more possibilities of something like contamination or tsunami or something like that may happen. Okay? There's a need for mathematical models. We are working on that. We're working in more exact mathematics. These are the foundations to start making mathematical models, as we have done for other areas of the supply chain. Finally, much more is to be done. How I'm doing with time?
You've got about 10 minutes.
Okay, that's it.
All right.
I'm done.